So let me minimize this. Everyone can see my screen okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, awesome. I think I could stop my video, but you can still see my screen? Okay. No, okay, that does work. Okay, so I just shared with you writing is more than words on a paper, and I'm going to take this from the perspective of a few well-known historical figures, some of whom Mutendei mentioned, who had to fight for the right to write, right? Writing is a luxury for many, and as I go through my presentation, you will see what I mean. So we are in Black History Month, and these are some of just the very few notable freedom fighters and some of our ancestors who've paved the way. So the first picture is of Frederick Douglass, who many of you know was an abolitionist, and he actually changed his name. He was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, but he changed his name to hide from his slave catchers when he escaped from the plantation. He was also the first Black citizen to hold high rank in the US government. He wrote the Narratives of Frederick Douglass, which I've had the pleasure of reading, which really highlighted the inhumanity of slavery. He shared his experience as a slave, but he risked his life to reveal this truth. And he also was risking his life to talk about how slaves were treated. He was able to raise funds through his speaking engagements outside of the United States, which he used to buy his freedom and launch an anti-slavery newspaper. So in his day, that was some revolutionary stuff to have the courage to do that. Then we have in the center Dr. Maya Angelou, who was born Marguerite Annie Johnson, and she's a well-known poet, but she was an author of 36 books. She made me fall in love with poetry through her book, I Know I Caged Birds Sing and Gathered My Name. She went through a lot of trauma. Unfortunately, she was raped at 7 and didn't speak for 5 years and became one of the greatest female orators of our time. Then we have Malcolm X, who literally laid the foundation for Black pride and nationalism and helped to rebuild the self-esteem of a people who were, in slavery and in bondage and told they were nothing, literally treated like property, legislated to be treated like property. And then going through the next slide, we have 3 other notable freedom fighters and writers and authors. James Baldwin, who was a well-known poet, essayist, novelist. He was able to really speak truth to the power structures in media. If you watch any of his interviews, just the way he conducted himself, the way he dissected racism, and even made those who interviewed him, who may not have liked him, really think differently about how Black Americans were treated during his time. He grew up in poverty and was able to really break down a lot of barriers and norms through his writing. Then in the center, Marianne Shadd, who was born in the United States, but made her way to Canada. And what's interesting, she came here 1 year before the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act allowed slave owners to recapture escaped slaves person after slavery has been abolished. So she just escaped that. And in coming here, she was able to establish the first racially integrated school for Black refugees. She played a very important role in giving Black people, especially women, a voice, and she advocated for women's rights. She used her platform to ignite freedom, healing, and power. She then went back to the States and became the first Black woman to complete a law degree and the first Black female to establish a newspaper when she was in Canada. And then we have Marcus Garvey, which is someone that a whole workshop would be needed to talk about his legacy, but I'll just keep my highlights short in the interest of time. He was born in Jamaica, which is actually where my parents are from, but he specifically came from a parish called St. Anne's Bay, which is where my mother and sister were born. Author of several books, and he did some very revolutionary things in his time. Not only did he start the first trade union in Jamaica known as the Printers Union, he established a Black Star Line, a shipping company, and he had a big vision of what he wanted to do with that. But what's interesting, between 1919 and 1920, he was able to raise $800,000 through his organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He was, of course, inspired by Booker T. Washington, who I'll highlight next, but he firmly believed that Africans needed to make themselves economically independent wherever they lived, and this showed through his writings. This is how his vision came to life. Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave in Virginia, as another author who co-authored many books and shared very powerful ideas for how African Americans who were formerly slaves and some who were still slaves, depending on what state you lived in, should advocate for economic independence through self-help and hard work. He was also able to build the Tuskegee Institute, which is still standing, and just transform that into a good example of excellence in terms of education. In the center, not that many people know about Shirley Chisholm, but Shirley Chisholm was the first African American to seek nomination for President of the United States for a major political party in 1972. She served 7 terms as a U.S. House Representative, the author of the book Unbossed and Unbought, which I've had the pleasure of reading a couple times. But she also, which is very significant, changed the culture of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party was not the party we saw today. We have to remember that was the party that wanted to keep slavery, that actually wiped out a lot of Black elected Republicans because the Republican Party was against slavery. So it's interesting how the ideologies somewhat shifted because of the foundations laid by Shirley Chisholm and the other members of the Congressional Black Caucus, which were other elected officials, but she was the only woman who was a part of the group of 13 that founded the Congressional Black Caucus. And then lastly, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, which unfortunately I don't have enough time to get into all the great achievements and the foundations he's laid for our community, but he's most notably known for becoming the founder of the NAACP, which is still standing today, which is still leading a lot of the challenges that we're facing in terms of police brutality, discrimination. These things have never ended, but because of social media, it seems like it's just arrived here. It's always been here, but social media has heightened things that has already happened, right? We see replays of George Floyd, but Emmett Till's case was actually even more traumatizing. We just didn't have the digitization of the constant murder of people of African ancestry. So that's just a brief highlight of very important, notable figures who, for me, I found inspiration and really was able to realize that there is so much power in the pen. So in this slide, you will see that I'm highlighting institutions of power. So print and digital media is extremely powerful because it shapes how the world sees others. It shapes how we even see ourselves. Sometimes we're overrepresented in certain aspects of media. Think of entertainment, think of athletes. But then when you look at the judicial system or you look at government, we need to ask ourselves, like, who are the people at the top of these hierarchical structures? Who's the producers of media? Who owns the media? Who's creating the narrative that we see on the news or controlling the narrative? When we look at our education institutions, it's really important to highlight that we have Bethune-Cookman, which was founded in 1902 by Mary Bethune. And she started this school with $1.15, faith in God, and 5 students. 1904 is when she founded it. It's still standing and has graduated over 19,000 students since 1940. So we have to pay attention to the fact that, and Mutendei indicated this, that there tends to be this pattern of portraying people of African heritage or people of other ethnic groups in these subservient roles as criminals, hypersexualized, angry, or just constantly as actors and entertainers. Or even in mainstream, in digital media, we're seeing a replay of what used to happen in Black and white TV shows when we think of minstrel shows and how African Americans were portrayed. There's actually a lot of power in being the writer and the producer. It's one thing to be an actor. It's great to be the next Denzel, but there's also some power in doing what Ava DuVernay is doing and what Denzel is doing when he's behind the camera as opposed to in front of the camera. And we have the opportunity, especially when we live in a democracy, and not everybody's living in a democracy, to tell our stories and to shape how the world views us. We don't have to tell our stories in a way that reflects stereotypes or negative images of our people just because that's might be the thing that will sell more, and you can see it in the content of the music that's being produced. And we don't want to limit our culture to just one way because it's a very diverse and rich culture. So any questions before I move along? Okay, so I wanted to highlight something that's really essential, especially for those of us who are writers or aspiring writers. There was a time in history where through the legal system and slave codes, which was an aspect of how some of these laws were implemented, that America had anti-literacy laws and banned the distribution of anti-literacy slavery literature. And I mentioned how, Frederick Douglass and there's others who wrote about the conditions of slavery. That was illegal in those times, right? And even having meetings to teach African Americans to read or write was illegal. And that was happening in Virginia. In Alabama, 1833, there was a slave code that asserted any person or persons who shall attempt to teach a free person of color or a slave to spell, read, or write shall, upon conviction thereof indictment, be fined in a sum of less than $250. That fine would be equivalent to $7,600 today. A free person of color shall be fined, imprisoned, or whipped at the discretion of the court, not exceeding 39 lashes or less than 20 lashes. So imagine living in these conditions and wanting to share your story. And so it brings me to the quote by James Baldwin, who I mentioned earlier. The whole language of writing for me is finding out what you don't want to know and what you don't want to find out. So when reading and the ability to write opens your eyes, it makes you feel what Frederick Douglass was feeling when he said, learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. And so as you read the narratives of Frederick Douglass, you're feeling his pain. You're seeing that he felt powerless, but even in a very powerless position, he was still able to rise above and find the courage and have that resilience to not just liberate himself, but many other slaves, and work closely with President Lincoln to help form the Emancipation Proclamation. So writing has a price, right? And for those of us who live in certain parts of the world, whether it's democratic societies, it could be a luxury, right? There's some people, they're too busy to write. They're literally having to work 9 to 5. They have kids to feed. They don't have the time. I spent a lot of my time writing on commute to school, right? While I was studying a student. Being a city in Hong Kong right now in Myanmar, where if you're a journalist or you're somebody who wants to write about those conditions, it is very risky, right? People who are activists are putting their lives on the line still today. So in preparing for this presentation, I discovered the Walker's Appeal, which I never heard about. I was more familiar with Frederick Douglass. And David Walker, who was from Wilmington, North Carolina, published this appeal in the 1700s and it was republished a couple times. But he was born free because his mother was free. So there were some laws that allowed that. He settled in Boston, and in this time, he was able to start a used clothing store and became a leading spokesperson against slavery. And so in the appeal, it really highlighted the abuses and inequities of slavery. But the way he distributed it was very interesting. He distributed copies of his book by sewing it into the linings of sailors' clothing, because a lot of sailors were the people buying the used clothing. A bounty was placed on his head, but he refused to hide and was willing to die for his writings. He became a contributor for the first African-American newspaper known as the Freedom Journal, and died in his early 30s by suspected poison. So imagine doing what he did in his time at such a young age. That really shows a lot of courage. So this brings me to a quote by Marcus Garvey: "Emancipate ourselves from mental slavery." And you hear that line through a song by Bob Marley called Redemption Song, which I didn't realize was from a speech that Marcus Garvey delivered. And it ties into Frederick Douglass. Now, this quote from Frederick Douglass in his book, Narratives of a Slave, was speaking about an underground system he created where he was teaching slaves to read and write secretly, in secret. And he was able to do it in religious buildings because they were allowed to learn about religion, but they didn't know that they were teaching them how to read and write. So he had to do this in secret. And he says this, which is very powerful: "They came because they wished to learn. Their minds had been starved by their cruel masters. They had been shut up in mental darkness. I taught them because it was the delight of my soul to be doing something that looked like bettering the conditions of my race." I actually had the honor of meeting Marcus Garvey's son, Dr. Julius Garvey, who's pictured here. He lives in the States. He comes to Canada quite often. And his father once said, "A race without authority and power is a race without respect." Marian Shad, who I highlighted earlier, the motto for her newspaper was, "Self-reliance is a fine road to independence." Shirley Chisholm has a very powerful quote. Oh, this thing at the top is hiding it. Here we go. You don't make progress by standing on the sidelines, whimpering and complaining. You make progress by implementing ideas. I highly suggest everybody reads her book. It is very powerful, Unbought and Unbossed. Okay, there we go. And then we have a wonderful poem by Maya Angelou, Still I Rise. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air, I rise. And then Booker T. Washington, who I highlighted earlier, excellence is to do a common thing in an uncommon way. I have learned that success is to be measured not by, sorry, the bars are in my way, is to be measured not by so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which we have overcome while trying to succeed. And then I'll end with a quote by, before I talk about my story as an author, Dr. Martin Luther King. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving. So it's really important that we find the courage to just start, right? Sometimes when it comes to writing a book, starting a business, you really have to start. You can't be afraid to fail forward, fall, you get back up, you do it again. And when you think of the kind of conditions that these type of people wrote in or started movements in, right? It's very, very powerful. So I do want to talk about my story, but before I do that, I wanted to see if anyone had any questions.
See, do we have any questions? Feel free to jump in, guys.
We'll jump in.
Well, before we get to your story, I just want to say that's an amazing presentation that you just gave us on the historical context of our leaders who use their voice and their pen to convey, you know, the trauma, the freedom, and the sacrifices they make to become who they are. And this is an example of Black history, and you are Black history just by, you know, being here and taking this initiative. For those of you who are joining us and who are new to writing, you know, like Martin Luther King say, if you can't fly, then run, you know, and if you can't write with the pen, then guess what you can do? You can voice it.
That's right.
In terms of an audio book, you know, so amazing presentation. I really love it. I really love it so far.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I'll keep it moving, everyone. So getting into my story to becoming an author. And so I'm someone who wanted to be a lawyer, obviously, because I was reading books like what I shared, didn't get into law school, but I had this creative side. I love to sing. I love music, but I hid it. I kept that side of me locked in a box collecting dust. So only those really close to me, my family, knew I'd love to sing, knew I'd love to do poetry. And I would write. I started writing at 17, but I was writing from a place of pain. So writing for me is how I was able to escape my reality and, you know, challenges or my own traumas that I experienced. I would get lost in books, reading and writing, just loved it. Once my sister, who I think's on the line, gave me as gifts, Gathered in My Name by Maya Angelou, and I Know I Cage Bird Sings, I was hooked to poetry, loved all her work. But unfortunately, I lost two cousins to gun violence. Both of them were killed at the age of 21. And I had a lot of grief, lost a lot of sleep, didn't know what to do with my emotions. I just felt frustrated, confused, angry, didn't seek a grief counselor, didn't understand what that was. But writing poetry is how I was able to deal with those emotions and express my pains and write those words that I just could not speak. And it helped me to find healing and my own freedom. And writing is how I was able to express my views, thoughts, emotion, and experience. So it took 20 years for me to actually publish my first book of poems, Deeper Reflections of Life, Words to Inspire the Heart and Uplift the Soul. And so what pushed me to say, I got to get this book done was, again, sadness, losing my wonderful mother who's pictured here. She was my pillar, my rock, the most amazing mother anyone could have. I always used to tell her, Mom, you know, you are like just like, I don't need anything else. Like, having you as a mom is like the greatest blessing. I don't know if there could be a blessing bigger than you as a mom. She gave her heart to everyone who knew her. And so I wanted to make my book a tribute to her, to honor her legacy, because she was someone who spent the last 20 years of her life tutoring hundreds of kids in the neighborhood that I grew up in, of all backgrounds and cultures. And many of these students, I'm in touch with them. They're in university, they're doing wonderful. And she dedicated her time and her heart and so much compassion to helping them achieve academic success. And this was while she worked as a nurse. And she was one of the nurses at work. You know, we're in a pandemic. She worked during SARS. She was one of the SARS nurses, as they say. And so she started her business running a Saturday class. And she did it because I was diagnosed with a learning disability. So she started to tutor me. Then she started to tutor my cousins and neighbors' kids and all this stuff. And then she realized, wait a second, there might be a lot of other kids in the public school system with this issue of not being able to read phonetically or understand phonetic learning. So she created this whole program, did all this research, got books from Jamaica, different parts of the States, and was just really transforming the lives of children. I had the privilege of working closely with her to help her do that. And so I wanted to also connect my book to a cause greater than me. So 10% of my annual sales will be going to a charity that I'm actually still involved with. I'm working part-time for them right now, the Olive Branch of Hope. And they are a nonprofit for the last 20 years who have been providing services to Black women battling cancer. It is just an amazing organization. We're actually hosting a free workshop next Saturday if anybody's interested on financial planning. So in terms of my book summary, the way I decided to put it together was very simple. I used an independent publisher, and it includes a prologue of my childhood and how basically my perspective on the world and what influenced me. It's a collection of my faith. It's faith-inspired poetry. And so there's 31 poems, 14 handwritten notes by my mom. It includes quotes with Jamaican, British, American culture, quotes that, you know, every mickle make a muckle is a Jamaican saying, and then it explains what does that mean in English. And it's also a snapshot of my mom's life, and it includes endorsements by various people who were mentors to me. And for me, the purpose of my book is to share my spiritual journey through poetry, my understanding of God, and my hope is that it will help those who are looking for a deeper meaning of life. So this is just a highlight from my book launch. So I had a huge book launch in July. And I had to organize this 3 weeks before my book publisher dropped me and said, you have to figure out how to get your book to print on your own, which was frustrating. But I'm somebody who knows how to figure things out. And so I figured out how to get my book to be distributed and printed and delivered to all the attendees. And many of the attendees actually were my mom's former students who are all grown up and their parents. And I've been blessed with amazing friends who cover the cost of their tickets. So they were able to come complimentary and partake in the food and the music and all the wonderful things. And it was just a very memorable event. So on my website, I do have a video reel of that book launch. So in my book, these are just small excerpts of some of my poetry. So for example, I have a poem called Keep Shining Your Light. Keep shining your light through life's strains. Sometimes it has to rain to wash away the pain. After moments of sorrow, the sun will shine tomorrow. The other poem is called In the Life After. It was the very first poem I wrote when my grandmother died, which I shared at her funeral. We sometimes wonder where our loved ones might be. They reside nearby in places that our eyes cannot see. In our dreams, they show us signs to guide us through this life of good and bad times. So the rest of it's in the book. So those are just excerpts. So in terms of getting your book into the hands of people, you want to have a good distribution outlet. I use a print-on-demand system, which Ingram Spark is a company that puts this all together. It's a one-stop shop used by major publishers as well. And because of it, my book is distributed across 30,000 distribution outlets. So you can get on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, you name it, it's there. And then global distribution. So from the US to the UK to Canada, you can get my book. I also have my book in as an ebook. I don't have an audio yet, but this is a very affordable way to distribute your book and get it into the hands and basically cut out the middle person. Also, I have a second book, which I co-authored, and this is another way for people who may not be ready to write a full book. Maybe you can co-author a chapter or page in a compilation of books. So this is 365 empowering stories. And my chapter is How Faith Can Conquer Fear. And I just picked up the hardcovers of that the other day. And hopefully when we open, I can have the opportunity to do a meet and greet. So that concludes my presentation and my stories. So I'm not on social media, but you can connect with me on my websites or by email. And this is a list of the references I used for the first part of my presentation. So I will stop sharing my screen. So I hope everyone found this valuable.
Oh, wow. Amazing, amazing, amazing presentation. Thank you so much.